Earlier this month, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration released their summary of weather disasters for the United States in 2022. What they found was that there were 18 weather or climate-related events that caused more than $1 billion in damage, including everything from droughts to floods to wildfires to severe storms, hurricanes, and winter storms. This is more than double the average of 7.9 since 1980 and led to the deaths of 474 people. Each death is a tragedy, of course, but 474 is practically nothing compared to a cyclone that struck South Asia in 1970. This one storm killed 600,000 people in one night. Millions more died in the aftermath of the storm, including a famine, a genocide, and a war that, believe it or not, came this close to nuclear Armageddon. This was, by any conceivable measure, the deadliest storm of all time. A storm that literally almost ended the world. Chances are you've never heard about it. Okay, yeah, I know, everything I just said sounded super hyperbolic and way over the top. But you're just gonna have to get used to that, because everything about this story is over the top. It also just happens to be true. The storm in question made landfall on November 12, 1970 in Bangladesh, and it came to be known as the Bhola Cyclone, named after one of the many islands that pretty much just wiped off the face of the earth. And the thing is, it wasn't even that bad of a storm. I mean, don't get me wrong, it was a bad storm, but it was more just a confluence of unlucky factors that made it so deadly. A perfect storm, if you will.
Yeah, Perfect Storm is what should have been the name of the book, but Sebastian Junger already took that.
Yeah, it's already been taken. Yeah. That's Scott Carney, an anthropologist and author who wrote a book called The Vortex about the Bhola Cyclone. I recently interviewed him for my podcast. Links down in the description.
No, I think it was like a category 4 hurricane, so it wasn't even the highest level category, but we still were having sustained winds of at least 140 miles an hour, so pretty big, but it's really the timing when it hit, right? So it comes in during a full moon, so you already have high tide, and at high tide, and that's when it makes landfall. So when you're dealing with islands that are only like 3 feet off of sea level, when you have a 20-foot storm surge, the only people who survive were the people who climb trees and stay there overnight.
In 1970, Bangladesh had a population of 64.2 million people spread across 144,000 square kilometers. That's about the same size as the state of Iowa, with 2.9 million residents today. Why do so many people live there? Well, for the same reason that the Egyptians were able to survive as an empire. Egypt and Bangladesh are both situated on river deltas. Just as the Nile enriches the soil of Egypt, the Ganges enriches the soil of Bangladesh. Both rivers drag nutrients from upstream into the ocean. In Bangladesh, the nutrients support bumper crops of rice, tea, and jute, a kind of fiber that's used in coffee bags. And when the Bhola cyclone struck, it depopulated. We're using the word depopulated here. Entire islands in the Ganges Delta. Early reports focused on the largest island, Bhola, which is how the cyclone got its name, but there are harrowing stories of survival and loss from all over the area, including the island of Manipura, where, as Scott details in his book, there lived a young man named Mohammad Hai.
So Mohammad Hai is like a teenager, 18 years old, loves football, fishes during the day, and like dreams of bigger things in his life. And he's in this tiny little like clay village, clay house. And the storm surge car's coming in. So all of his family members are like, okay, we've been through a lot of cyclones before. We'll just gather up all the animals. We'll all just sit in our 2-story house and wait out the storm. The storm starts coming up, and the water starts filling up his house. And his family is reading the Quran, trying to pray the storm away. It's not working. And they climb up to the 2nd story of their house, and the water keeps on going up. And Hai actually breaks through the roof, through the tin roof, and is telling his family to come up as they're sort of, their chins are just above the water level. He decides that he has to jump to a tree, and he'll get all of his family to go to the palm tree that's right next to the house. He jumps on it and is calling back to his family for hours as these 140 mile an hour winds are all around him, and his entire family drowns. And then the eye goes over him, and there's just dead silence, raging winds, and then in a second it all turns to nothing. It's just dead calm. You're like, whoa, is it over? And then he looks around, he talks to an uncle, a neighboring house, and there's only one survivor over there. And then the storm all kept back up again, and he has to hold on for another 6 or 7 hours.
Finally, in the early hours of the morning, the weather had passed, and he was able to climb down from the tree. But sadly, this was just the beginning of the disaster for him. All told, over 40,000 of Manipura's 50,000 inhabitants were dead. He spent the next week helping to bury corpses in mass graves all over the island, and later became an aid worker. Later still, he became a freedom fighter. And there are thousands of similar stories from this cyclone. One grandmother survived because her servants tied her to a tree, and then all the servants drowned.
We also interviewed one guy, and we didn't use him in the book, but he spent the whole night in a tree with a nest of king cobras, because they all wanted to escape too. And the cobras weren't going to go bite him because they were, also traumatized by this event.
Now you might wonder why nobody tried to warn the people of Bhola and Manipura and all these other islands to evacuate. Well, the irony is, if you want to use the word irony, is that the science of meteorology had recently just taken a huge step forward. A prototype weather satellite called IDOS-1 had just launched in January of 1970. It was meant to provide infrared and visual photographs for meteorologists to analyze, and it did. It worked perfectly. The problem was the turnaround time. For example, there was a meteorologist named Neil Frank. He's kind of a legendary meteorologist at this point. He later went on to become the director of the National Hurricane Center in Florida. But he received a picture of the Bhola Cyclone from shortly before landfall. He immediately saw the danger in this storm and would have sent warnings worldwide. The only problem is, it was a week old by the time it came across his desk.
He gets the film roll late to develop it, and the New York Times reports on the storm before he knows what's going on.
Now, this wasn't IDOS-1's fault. It was working perfectly. It snapped the picture on November 12th and transmitted it to NOAA that day. The problem was, there was no internet back then. That picture today could just be emailed to Neil Frank. He would have had it in nanoseconds. But back then, they had to actually put it in an envelope and physically mail it to him. And it was this disaster, and others like it, that led to the building of the infrastructure that made it possible to get that information around the world in a timely manner, the internet and all of that stuff we completely take for granted today. Of course, there were also local meteorologists that saw it coming with radar and whatnot, and they knew what they were looking at, and they knew how dangerous it was. The problem was, IDOS-1 wasn't the only new thing in the meteorological world. They had also just updated their warning system.
And then meanwhile, there's all these weird warnings coming in off the radio system that they'd never heard before, because Pakistan has just instituted a new cyclone warning system, and no one knew what it meant. Yeah, it's like you switch the red lights and the green lights on all of your all of your traffic signs in your building, in your city, and then you just don't tell anyone you did it.
For example, when the local meteorologists saw the storm coming and sent out warnings over the radio, they called out red 4, red 4. The red, meaning red alert, and the 4, meaning a category 4 storm. Specifically, red 4 meant red alert, catastrophic destruction imminent, seek high ground immediately. But this was new and had never actually been used in Bangladesh before, so the people there didn't really know what the hell red 4 even meant. In fact, they were used to a 1 to 10 scale, so when they heard 4, that didn't sound like that bad of a storm at all to them. So because of this, many who could have evacuated didn't, and those who could have gone to higher ground stayed put. And as the storm approached, at high tide under a full moon, it just happened to turn just the right way to form a giant storm surge up the Ganges Delta. And a quarter of an area the size of Iowa, with 21 times the population of Iowa, was engulfed by several meters of water, literally washing 500,000 people out to sea, all in one night.
And when later we have these accounts of people going down the river to the most affected areas, and they'll be in the boat, and there'll be this smell that's coming in, like that's not a very nice smell, and they'll see like a body floating in the water, and then more and more bodies until the boat can't even navigate because there's so many corpses, and they're worried that their propeller's going to get full of human hair. I mean, this is a true nightmare.
The scale of this destruction is something most of us can hardly even imagine. But unfortunately, this was just the beginning. As we've seen in many other cases, it wasn't the disaster itself that caused the most suffering. It was the way people responded to it. Okay, so here's the deal. Throughout this whole video, I've been talking about how this storm hit and devastated Bangladesh. And technically, that's not true, because in 1970, Bangladesh didn't exist. Back then, Bangladesh was a part of Pakistan, which was way over here. This was West Pakistan, and this was East Pakistan. Now, if you see that map and it doesn't make any sense to you, well, you're not British. You probably know that the British once controlled India, part of that whole Asian land grab for spices thing all the European countries are into. Remember how everything is all about spices? Well, this was known as the British Raj. It was made up of land that is now India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, and Sri Lanka. And in 1947, when the British ended their occupation, they chose to partition this land out among religious lines. Hindu areas became India, Muslim became Pakistan. Now, if it sounds like I'm oversimplifying all this, I am. But, in my defense, so did they. because there were multiple different groups of Muslims in the British Raj, the Bengalis in the east and the Punjabis in the west among them. And these were entirely separate ethnic groups with different languages and histories and economies and everything. But the British, in their infinite wisdom, decided that instead of making them two separate countries, it would be simpler to just make them one country. Separated. And like most countries that experience a power vacuum, Pakistan went through decades of wars and coups and power struggles, but by 1970, when the cyclone hit, this was the basic state of things in Pakistan. The seat of power was in West Pakistan. East Pakistan was more populous and resource-rich, but it was divided amongst many different political parties, so they kind of had less sway and were treated more like a colony of the West than an equal. At the head of the government in West Pakistan was President Yahya Khan. He was a famed general and war hero from World War II, and he had big plans for the country. Yahya Khan had two main goals. First, he wanted to oversee the first free and fair election since partition. He really kind of saw himself as the George Washington of Pakistan. He wanted to be known as the man who finally brought stability to this country and set it on a course for success. To that end was his second goal. He wanted to make Pakistan a major player in the world stage. And his plan to do that was to engineer a meeting between the United States and China. He had a connection with Mao Zedong, and he knew that Nixon wanted to open diplomatic relations with China. Of course, at the time, this was the Cold War and everything. Nixon couldn't just, openly approach them, so Yahya Khan tried to serve as a sort of a back channel between the two. Nixon and Mao did famously have a summit in 1972, and Yahya Khan played a major part in that. He spent years cultivating a relationship with Nixon and his advisor, Henry Kissinger, to make it happen. Now, all of this paints a picture of Yahya Khan as a noble statesman, which he definitely had that side to him. But he also had another side. He was a drunken genocidal lunatic. When the Bhola Cyclone made landfall, his all-important election was only 25 days away, just less than a month out. Now, one option would have been for him to shower the Bengalis with help, to secure their votes. But he chose a different direction. In the spirit of never let a good disaster go to waste, he withheld aid from East Pakistan. He suppressed news reports and ordered the army to hoard any relief supplies, which led to hangars and airports just being loaded up with food and fuel and clothes and supplies while Bengalis starved in the streets. In his mind, the Bengalis were less likely to vote for him anyway, so why not just let this disaster take out as many of them as possible? In fact, our hurricane specialist I was talking about earlier, Neil Frank, he actually visited Pakistan on behalf of the World Bank, and he had an interesting exchange with a Punjabi general.
One general he goes to sort of sits him down, sort of off the record, let's turn off the microphone. He says, that cyclone solved 500,000 of our problems.
But this plan backfired when the election came because the Bengalis, who normally, were split up among many different party lines, instead they unified. They came out in droves and they voted for a man named Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, who was the head of a pro-independence party called the Awami League. Rahman, who went by Mujib to his followers, he had spent the last month distributing supplies as far and wide as he could, winning over the hearts and minds of the people. Now, you could say that he did it as a, campaign tactic or whatever, or maybe he did it out of kindness, but either way, it worked. So now Yahya Khan, who had made this election his life's work, not only lost the election, but he lost it to a Bengali who wanted independence for East Pakistan. So now he had a choice. He could accept the results of the election that he oversaw, handing over the government to what he considered to be an outsider, watch his country possibly split apart and lose any chance of ever making that Nixon-China connection he'd been working on. Or he could do some dictator shit. He chose to do dictator shit. He delayed the transfer of power over and over again for months and eventually had Mujib arrested and put in jail. And when the inevitable protests broke out in East Pakistan, he set into action a plan that he called Operation Searchlight. The name Operation Searchlight was specifically chosen to be as vague and innocuous sounding as possible, but it was nothing of the sort. In March 1971, just 4 months after surviving the deadliest storm of all time, East Pakistan suffered through one of the worst genocides of the 20th century. Between March and May of that year, up to 3 million Bengalis were slaughtered by Pakistani forces and millions more fled into neighboring India. The details of this are horrifying. I couldn't possibly cover it here on YouTube without getting demonetized. This video is already flirting with demonetization, so I made a whole separate video of it over on Nebula as part of my Forgotten Atrocities series. And this definitely fits the description of an atrocity. Basically, Yahya Khan's instructions were, kill 3 million people and the rest will eat out of our hands. That was an actual quote from him, so yeah. Just 3 million people. Some of the other topics I've covered on that series include the Irish famine and the Holodomor, which was basically the Ukrainian Holocaust. both of which are examples of natural disasters made a million times worse by human negligence or outright malice. It's a bit of a pattern. By the way, if you haven't checked out Nebula, it's a creator-owned streaming service where we're able to post content and videos not because it caters to some algorithm, but because we feel like it matters. And if the subject of this video is interesting to you, you should check out the Modern Conflict series from Real Life Lore, where he's covered topics like the Libyan Civil War, the Afghanistan War, and the Chinese genocide of the Uyghurs. Turns out there's a lot of bad stuff going on. We also post videos early and ad-free, so if you were watching this on Nebula, you wouldn't be hearing this part. In fact, you'd get extra content in its place. You'd also get to look down your nose at all the plebes that have to wait longer to see it. So that's nice. So if you haven't checked it out yet, just go to nebula.tv/Joe Scott. That's where you can find everything that I do, plus my podcast. Also, you find them early and ad-free, and like 150 other great educational creators and original series you can't find anywhere else. I know I'm in it, but it's also quickly becoming my go-to streaming service because pretty much everybody I follow is there with extra stuff that you can't see anywhere else. It's just better. Anyway, that's my pitch. Nebula is awesome, it's worth it, and it really does help support the channel and like hundreds of other channels. So nebula.tv/Joe Scott, go check it out. I think you'll like it. Now, where was I? All right, unspeakable human tragedy. So Operation Searchlight was terrible, it was horrible. You see all the details in that other video, but it led to an all-out war as Bengalis retaliated and fought back. And India, who already had decades of tension with Pakistan, began training and equipping the Bengalis. This led to a series of skirmishes that are formally known as the Indo-Pakistan War. And this is where things get really messy. Because India at the time had a cooperative agreement with the Soviet Union. And remember I said a second ago how Yahya Khan had been cultivating a relationship with Nixon? Yeah. So you have India on one side using Soviet weapons and Pakistan on the other side using American weapons. Where could this go wrong? It also turned out that Nixon wasn't really a fan of Mujib and the Awami League because their politics were a little too socialist for his taste. So now, right in the middle of Vietnam, which was basically a proxy war between the US and the Soviet Union, here comes another one. But because Vietnam was raging at the time and it was so expensive and so divisive, Nixon didn't really want to get completely involved in another war, so he attempted a bit of a half measure. He sent one ship to the Bay of Bengal as a show of force. But it wasn't just any ship, it was the USS Enterprise. The aircraft carrier, not the starship. Although it did have the power to go where no one had gone before, that place being total nuclear annihilation. On its own, the Enterprise carried more firepower than 2,000 Hiroshimas. So that's one hell of a half measure. The Soviets, of course, couldn't just sit idly by and let that happen, so they sent a trio of nuclear subs as a countermeasure. And the commander was given a simple order: don't let the Americans come within range of targets in India. And the Americans were given orders to not let the Soviet show of force deter them because it was worth ending the human race rather than look weak. So yeah, once again, the fate of all of humanity came down to just a few ship captains playing chicken with each other. God, the Cold War was stupid. So you have this literal line in the water that the Soviets will not let the Enterprise go past. The Enterprise is just inching forward, and the Soviet subs came to the surface, each communicated with each other and said that their orders were to basically set the world on fire if the other didn't back down. But luckily for us all, within literal hours before an escalation were to take place, the Bengali independence forces took the capital of Dhaka, and Pakistan conceded defeat on December 16, 1971.
The only reason you were born, the only reason anyone who's listening to this is still alive, is because these dudes, these former fishermen with some mines and grenades, defeated the genocidal regime of Yahya Khan.
Bangladesh was finally a free country. Mujib was released after nearly a year in jail and became the country's first president, later its first prime minister. And I would love to say that things were happily ever after from that point, but that's not the truth. The truth is Bangladesh had been completely devastated. First by the worst storm of all time, then by a genocide and a civil war that killed up to 3 million people. Plus, as part of Operation Searchlight, Yahya Khan specifically targeted political figures in the country's academics and elites, and they emptied out the banks of their reserves with the sole purpose of setting them back as far as possible. Bangladesh had to rebuild itself from the ground up, which is never easy, but as often happens after revolutions and civil wars, years of struggles by various groups for power led to even more waves of violence. In fact, Mujib only served as prime minister for 8 months before he was assassinated in 1975. It really wasn't until the 90s that Bangladesh was able to find stability and finally recover from the series of tragedies they had endured. Now, since the Bhola Cyclone, our ability to track and predict storms has taken giant leaps. So while we can expect more and bigger storms as our climate changes, hopefully we won't ever see a disaster on this scale ever again. By the way, it's not the last bad storm to hit Bangladesh. In fact, Bangladesh is also, somehow, home to the deadliest tornado in history. It was called the Daulatpur Sadaria tornado, and it hit in 1989, and it killed more people than any other tornado in history. Probably, again, because it's just such a highly populous place. By the way, if you're wondering, Yahya Khan was ousted as president soon after the war, and he was put in house arrest for the next 8 years. He died 1 year after being released, and is now remembered basically as just a dark stain on the history of Pakistan. It is quite possible that no country has suffered as much in the last 50 years as Bangladesh. Their story is one of perseverance and grit, and one that we just don't hear about very much here in the United States. But we should, because it's important. Anyway, my interview with Scott Carney is up on the Conversations with Joe channel. You can find that link down below. Go check it out. There's a lot more details there. You can also find that in the bonus video about Operation Searchlight over on Nebula, which I deeply encourage you to do. Operation Searchlight was insane. All right, thanks for watching, and a huge shout out to the Answer Files on Patreon and the channel members that are keeping the channel going and giving me good ideas, giving me feedback. I actually had some people that went through one of my most recent scripts and did fact checking for me, which is always super appreciated. But there's some new members I need to shout out real quick. We've got MJS, Kenneth White, Michael McBride, Daniel Groh, Jeff Millenick, Polly the Wicked, Andrew Brown, Gregory J. Silva, APC, Adam Hyland, and Brian Jorgensen. Thank you guys so much. If you would like to join them and get a little thing next to your name in the comments that makes you stand out a little bit, you'll get early access to videos and live streams, all kinds of cool stuff. Anyway, all you have to do is just hit the little join button down below this window. Please do like and share this video if you liked it. And if this is your first time here, here's another video you can check out. Google thinks you'll like that one, or you can look at any of the other thumbnails that have my face on them down on the sidebar if you're watching on your browser. Please do go check them out, and if you enjoy them, I invite you to subscribe. I come back with videos every Monday. As always, t-shirts and merch available at the merch store, answerswithjoe.com/store. We got a lot of cool new stuff coming, so if you've never really checked it out, go check it out, because yeah, you might find something you like. And it helps support the channel, obviously. All right, that's it for today. You guys go out there, have an eye-opening rest of the week. Stay safe, and I'll see you next Monday. Love you guys. Take care.